All right, we'll get started in about 10 minutes here. Thanks everybody for joining us. Only about 5 more minutes to wait. Hang in there, guys. All right, we've just got about 2 minutes left and we'll get started. Adam, are you there? Oh, I don't think Adam's connected his audio yet. Hi, Adam, are you there?
I am. I'm here.
Okay, and you sound pretty good. We will get started in just about two minutes.
Okay, I'm ready.
All right. All right, it's 11 o'clock. Let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Agile Friday. I'm Justin Burns from the Office of the CIO. I'll be your host. Joining us today is Adam Light from SOTEC Advisors. Adam will be talking to us about plan to replan using adaptive planning and Agile methods to deliver value from an advanced infrastructure project. This is a 1-hour event with 30 minutes presentation from Adam, followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. Using the chat window, you can send questions at any time, and we'll forward them on to Adam after the presentation. Submit those privately to me, Justin Burns, or via the public chat. Agile Fridays are a collaboration between the Office of the CIO and Results Washington. Find out more and keep up to date at ocio.wa.gov/agile-fridays. Big thanks to Adam and SOTEC Advisors for helping us out today. With that said, I will turn control over to Adam.
Thanks, Justin. Can you hear me okay?
You sound great.
Okay, good. Well, thanks everybody for joining on this Friday, and I'm looking forward to talking to you today. This is my third presentation and in your series, and when we started planning it, I suggested to Daryl that we should, start at the beginning with some basic things about Agile, move to some advanced topics in the middle, and then at the end kind of share some stories, case study type things. And so in that vein, this is a case study type example that I think will be interesting. So I'll get into that in just a minute, but I want to just introduce myself briefly. I'm a consultant. I've been founded my company 5 or 6 years ago, and coming from a software development and delivery background, specifically project management, and then moving into management, people management, portfolio management. So basically, I started with Agile looking for a better way to do things in the company that I was working with, not being satisfied with the way our methods were working out, looking for something better. And that's how I sort of became involved in Agile and kind of made that my cause and really what I want to do in my life. So I'm really excited to be here and share some of the things that I've learned along the way with you and tell you a story. So the story I'm going to tell you today is about learning to avoid risk and maximize value under pressure. And this slide, I think, is a great exemplar of that. This is from Mike Cohn's book, Agile Estimating and Planning, which is one of those books that was, that I was looking to when I was beginning to do Agile as a manager for the first time. And so what this graph really says is that it's fairly simple to look at it, that if you're trying to do something and you can figure out what the most valuable thing to do is and what the highest risk thing is, and you have to decide you want to do things incrementally, you want to deliver them a little bit at a time, it makes sense to do those things first that are high risk and high value, because you're maximizing what you learn and you're maximizing value at the same time. So risk isn't necessarily something to be avoided if you can determine whether that risk is going to pay off or not. But if you're doing something that's high risk and low value, it is something to be avoided, because you know, there's not a lot of upside there. So if you can prioritize your work on those two dimensions, then you it turns out you have a good chance of really making some positive change to the value of what your project is delivering, what your effort is delivering. So today I'm going to tell you about a specific project that I worked on for a client, with a client over about a year period. And what happened on this project, how it realized that it was in a pretty risky place, a pretty dangerous place, how we turned things around briefly in response to that, and then the process of learning that unfolded, allowing people to implement something along the lines of what I showed you in that graph at the beginning. I'm going to focus on a specific business process to kind of explain how that happened on one sub-project on this much larger project, and then kind of reflect on what we might have done if we applied the principles that I just described from an earlier stage, or if the project had learned about this earlier. So this particular project wasn't at its heart an IT project, or it wasn't totally an IT project. So this was a project done by an electric utility, and what's been going on in the utility industry over the past 10 years or so was going on at this utility. They've been automating their meters around the houses. So instead of having people come around every month and actually visit every house in the service territory, they want to be able to read those meters wirelessly or electronically, and that lets them save the cost of going around to reading meters, but also doing a lot of other cool things that add value for ratepayers, increasing efficiency, and so on. So they were installing, in this case, 830,000 meters. There's a two-way wireless network to communicate with those meters, so you could both send them instructions and receive data back. And so this was a pretty expensive project for the size of this company. This is $154 million, most of that was a capital investment. And so it was a long project. It was spanning about 5 years. They had to build out the network infrastructure, then they had to decide to deploy the meters and do other upgrades on all those customers. And then they had business process changes that went along with that. So just having the infrastructure in place was not enough to realize the value, and that's an important thing. Although this was an infrastructure project, increasingly what we see in our society is that infrastructure leverages technology, or maybe the other way around. Technology and infrastructure have to work together in order to deliver the value that we're seeing. You can't just put out the infrastructure. You have to also have business process changes that are technology enabled in order to realize those benefits. Oops. Sorry about that. I'm going to go back, push the wrong button. Get back to where I was. Okay, sorry about that. So what outcomes was this project achieving? So for that $154 million investment, they expected to get annualized operating cost savings of about $18.2 million. And so the calculated return on equity, given their standard formula, was $35 million. So they're going to get, for $154 million investment, they were going to get an additional, they're going to pay back that investment and get $35 million additional. So this had benefits to shareholders, and it had benefits to customers. And the customers' benefits included that customers would be able to select when they wanted their meter to be read and when they wanted to pay their bill, so they wouldn't be tied to the cycle of when people happen to visit their house to read the meters. They'd be able to have more real-time data about their energy usage so they could manage it better, because these smart meters allowed the utility to read the meters as frequently as every 15 minutes and provide data to the customers, share the data with the customers. It's going to improve the ability to spot trends. So if you have a high bill and you're trying to figure out why did my bill go up this month, you could pinpoint that to the day you bought a new refrigerator, or the day you started charging your electric car, or whatever the cause was of that surprisingly high bill, which turned out to be one of the most frequent reasons that people call the electric utility. And then the last thing is the utility is able to share that net present value savings. They're able to pass that on to ratepayers in the form of either lower rates or rates that would be lower than they otherwise would have been given everything else that was going on in the environment. So benefits for shareholders, benefits for customers, what's not to like. There's a lot to be seen in terms of benefit from this infrastructure project, but we have to deliver it effectively. And so it said that process benefits leveraged infrastructure. So this is just sort of an example, an illustration of the way those benefits broke down. So on the cost side, in the pie chart on the left, the actual infrastructure was predominantly the meters and the meter deployment. So laying out all of those physical meters, the cost of removing the old one and installing the new ones on people's houses is 75% of the cost. But just installing the meters doesn't get you any benefit, because the meters can't yet communicate back to to the billing systems and so on. So then in order to communicate back, you need that network infrastructure, which initially was fairly inexpensive, but it's a critical component in the communication network. So then once you have the meters deployed and they can communicate back, you still need business process automation and systems in the back end. So about 20% of the project was, by cost, was the IT, what we'd strictly call the IT component in the traditional IT department. On the benefit side, on the right, by far the biggest benefit was this yellow bar, which is not having to go around and read the meters. So this company has a very long history. People always ask, well, what happened to meter readers? And so this company had a very long history of taking care of its employees, and they started, even before the project started, they started change management, retraining, finding a path for those employees. So some of them, first thing they did was they stopped hiring permanent meter readers. They started hiring temps. So there was, over the 5 years as people retired and took other jobs, they were replaced by temporary workers. So they weren't hiring people and then let them off a year later. Many of those people were retrained, and they found jobs in other areas of the industry, such as what they call the one-call industry, with people going out and delivering, like locating wires and underground pipes and stuff like that. And some of them even retrained with a company provided resources, and in a couple of cases they've actually found jobs as workers on our IT side of the project, and over that period of 5 years they were able to take their expertise from the domain, the business domain. They were able to learn, go to school, learn what they needed to learn, and eventually become QA engineers or even developers in the IT department. So, there was a lot of change, a lot of investment to make that change, to take the sting out of that change and capitalize on the benefits. So that was the yellow bar. And then these other bars, that's really what we're going to talk about today, and in particular the pink one there. So, this is what sometimes is called the long tail. So I would say the biggest bang for the buck was that yellow bar in terms of benefit, but we had to get all of them in order to realize the net present value and to realize the business case. It was a challenging, complex project. What we discovered when I joined the project was that people were worried about that IT investment. They were worried that they were going to be able to deliver on all of those components of business process change and IT change within the span of time that was allowed by the project. And so we did some analysis, and what we showed using the various estimates for the various projects is that in order to meet the current scope as it was defined, we would need to staff up, and our staffing curve would need to follow this blue line that's shown here. So we would need to ramp up rapidly to about 75 people on the project, 60 to 75 people. We need to peak at about 90 people, and then we need to kind of gradually tail off. So that was what we would have needed to have done in about an 11-month period from the time that I got involved. At the time, when we sort of calculated up the partial FTEs and the number of people that were actually working on the project, it turned out to be about 10. So we had almost an order of magnitude difference between the actual staffing levels and the levels that would have been needed to achieve all of the scope that had been identified as necessary and essential. So the first thing you can see there is that we're not going to be able to do it all. So we asked, well, how could we, given the way this organization is configured, the way it works, how could we ramp up? Like, what could we achieve if we just followed the normal staffing procedures with the managers doing what they're doing? And then that was the orange line. So if we just, mobilize using the available tools, we would eventually, by the end of the project, probably get up to about 30 people working on the project. So that wasn't going to work. We weren't going to be able to just deliver the scope that we had, or that had been laid out that far, and follow business as usual procedures to deliver it. So something radically different was called for. Looking at the timeline and how we got there, so over this long period of time, the company had begun very early. They'd done an impact assessment. The project had followed along. They'd gotten in this period for where they basically had done all the requirements, then they couldn't get started on. They had done all the requirements again. They had put development on hold for a period of time for 8 or 9 months. But meanwhile, the project, the infrastructure part, had just kept marching on while the software part was delayed. So by the time we got to this overall kind of 4-year layout, by the time we got 3 years into the 4 years, and that graph that I just showed you was produced, kind of 75% of the available timeline to act on that scope was gone. So we had to think fast and do something different. Whatever it was we were doing, though, it was clear that it wasn't working. So the certain perils of doing nothing outweighed the risk of trying something different. So there's a powerful case for change and a powerful appetite for trying something that might work. So one of the things, what we did was we basically changed and mobilized the IT organization, and we implemented a new way of working. So where previously things had been done in a very methodical and disjointed sort of federated manner with every small department following its own processes and procedures, we basically pulled about 60 or 70% of the applications department into a special purpose organization just to do this project. So we prioritized this project over everything else. And we implemented Scrum to organize the work of that project. So hopefully some people have been on some of the earlier webinars and seen kind of what Scrum is. There's a number of things about that. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the essence of Scrum is that you deliver incrementally in small increments, which are called sprints. And at the end of every sprint, you're able to look ahead and adapt to what you've learned and to replan your future and the next increment. So you're not laying things out and trying to plan 5 years at a time or a year at a time. You're planning in this case, 3-week increments. So then the next thing was, okay, we've mobilized resources, so we're able to get not to 70 or 90, but we're able to get to maybe 60 people working on this project. We still aren't going to get all the scope done as it was originally laid out. So we need to prioritize. So we prioritize based on the value. So we prioritize these we call business process projects in the order of the value or their contribution would be to that overall annualized saving. And of course, that one that was shown in yellow was the first one. That was basically already taken off the list and done. So these are the remaining projects. Meter exchange, which was the ability to change out old meters for new meters, to replace the smart meters when they need to be replaced. And then the second one that I'm going to talk about was this one that's called connects here. So that's the ability to turn power on and off. And so one of the things that happened in the utility is that a lot of times there would be move-ins and move-outs or disconnections for credit reasons. And if somebody is leaving the apartment say somebody moves out on the 21st and cancels their service, and the new person doesn't move in until the 3rd of the following month, there's 11 or 12 days there where there may not be anybody, it may be undefined who's paying the bill. So the refrigerator's still running, somebody left the lights on, the furnace is still running, and if nobody's signed up to pay for that, then potentially the utility is paying for that. So there's situations, a whole range of use cases like that, or situations where the utility is paying for it because they're not able to it isn't cost effective to send a human out to turn off the power and then send a human back out 10 days later to turn the power back on, or 2 days later. But if you can aggregate all those things and you can automatically turn things on and off from the central office, even without human intervention, then you can recoup a substantial amount of value. So that's what we set out to work on, is these projects in this order. We knew that if we didn't get to them all, at least we'd be capturing value first. So then the organization got started on a number of these projects. We had 6 or 7 teams working on 6 or 7 of those sub-projects in parallel. And if you learned about Scrum and you know about Lean, you recognize the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, or the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, which is the continuous improvement engine that's described in Lean. And Scrum really, the point is that Scrum is really doing the same thing, and it's doing it on a number of time scales. So we do it on the project or release time scale. We do it on the sprint or increment time scale, and then we do it on a daily time scale. So Scrum, if it's implemented well and people have the tools and the support that they need, is a very powerful engine for learning rapidly. And so we have this whole new department learning very rapidly, including the business people who are doing the prioritization and kind of governing things. So then what we learned to do is to break things down into smaller and smaller chunks and to dynamically prioritize those chunks. So just because all of those bars that I showed in the previous chart were sort of ranked in order of value, it doesn't mean that you needed all of the scope in each one to realize most of the value. Nor does it mean that you were going to be able to realize all of the value. There might be risks that would increase the cost or prevent you from realizing value. So basically what we learned, or what we did, was to teach this new department and the business people to prioritize dynamically in the face of risk and value, and to make good decisions about their collective choices. So when information changes, you need to keep making decisions. You can't just prioritize once. You need to keep reprioritizing to realize your goals. So things did change both internally about what we learned and also externally. So this just gives an idea of that change. So the right-hand side is showing the actual way things are stacked up when we delivered them in terms of the value that they brought. So by the end of the project, where things were. And you can see into the left, where things were proposed at the beginning of the project, how things were updated in the middle. So that the change in the size of those colored bars indicates the magnitude of change of how we learned and understood about value. So there were some external factors, which I don't have time to go into, environmental things like the cost of energy and the cost of fuel to run trucks and stuff like that. But the actual net estimate didn't change all that much. But within the project, the specific components of that changed quite a bit as we learned through that intensive period of learning of about a year. So this kind of raises a question in your organization where you work. How long would it take you to learn and to change if you learned that the value of something had changed by 300%? If you go back here, we have some of these bars where the amount that we thought, the amount of value that we thought would be provided and not that was actually provided tripled or was reduced by 2/3, and that information came to light, relatively speaking, overnight. So what I'm going to do is describe now, just kind of go through an example of one of those projects. This is the Connect project, where we were trying to be able to disconnect and reconnect meters electronically or automatically. And so it turned out that there were different components of that. And the way that the company originally thought about things, they thought they had this sort of complex set of components put together. So they thought that, yeah, we needed to be able to connect and disconnect people, but in order to disconnect and reconnect people, we were going to need to be able to, so the sort of overall overview of that is that there has to be a business reason to connect or disconnect. You have to prepare to do the disconnection and reconnection. You actually have to do the transaction, and then there's going to be some kind of response. Either somebody is going to, their power's going to get shut off, and they're going to have it turned back on, or they're going to call up and they're going to want to make some kind of arrangement to have their power turned back on, or the new tenant's going to move in. So there's going to be an increase in the work, on the back end in response to increased frequency of being able to transact. So the connects, and so then they thought that we were able to do connects. So in order to be able to do a lot more connects and disconnects, and now we have the ability to disconnect somebody, and it's cost effective to turn off the power for even a day in between tenants or something. We're going to need to have automated phone calls. So we're going to need to be able to, since we're going to be doing, an order of magnitude more disconnects, we can't call people and notify them manually. We need to automate that. So that sort of falls in the category of we need to do that first before we can disconnect anybody. Then there's this idea that, when we call people, they're going to, we'll call people and tell them we're to disconnect. They're going to say, no, I need you to give me an extension so I can pay my bill so you won't disconnect. So that the volume of that's going to go up. So we need to work on the systems for that in order to handle the increased volume. And then when people call in to do that, there's going to be there's this process of redistributing payments that maybe were previously made but were applied to the wrong thing. So the volume of that's going to go up. So this is all business analysts sort of thinking ahead, like what they think is going to happen, and making decisions with business people about how this future state business process is going to work. So those things, we need to do those first before we can start calling people, before we can start disconnecting them, right? And then there's, the regulators are very concerned about low-income ratepayers being disconnected and being adversely affected. The company is very sensitive to that and wants to do the right thing for the community. So there's these agencies that help people whose power is about to be shut off with public, various forms of assistance to enable them to pay their bill. So we're going to have a whole bunch more of those things to deal with. So we need to introduce a portal to deal with those needs, right? And then there's this lack of contract process, which is sort of an arcane back office process, but we're going to need to build that up before we can do any of this other stuff. So the idea is that we have to have all of these things in order to actually start disconnecting people. So that's how the project was originally scoped. When we had that project that was saying we needed to, it was going to take 90 people for a year, it was assuming that you had to do all this scope in order to get the benefit of this implementing this connect process on the back of the advanced metering infrastructure. So what we did with that new department of people and what we were learning and the ability to prioritize dynamically in the face of information about risk and information about value was that we didn't have to do all of this work. We figured out a way to chunk things down. So we figured out a way that, okay, you might think, well, okay, we can do it at that arcane back office process, but we still need to do all these things because these are the things that actually affect customers. Or you might think that really we can do some stuff manually, but fundamentally the community impact and the need to help the agencies deal with the volume of and the increased rapidity of need to respond, we need to implement these parts of things. Or you might think that really, we just needed to be able to chunk things down to our internal departmental needs to do connects and the fundamental need to communicate before and after those. So we needed connects and automated phone calls. But what we actually did using sort of the principles behind Agile and that idea of focusing on risk first and value first was we found a way to break things down just to the very atomic nature of the transaction and to very incrementally build up to all these other things. So getting the most information we could and the most value we could from a very simple amount of work. So what happened in this process was I sort of asked the team that was implementing the business process software, what would it really take to, how much effort would it really take you to actually run an end-to-end transaction where you turned off a meter from the central office? And they said, well, we've got the infrastructure in place, we're communicating with the meters, we don't have all the meters in place, we're not communicating with all of them. We could do it. We think it would take about a sprint. So we think it would take about 3 weeks to get that core functionality in place. So all this other stuff was going to take, a whole team, like more than a year to do, probably several teams working in parallel, more than a year to do. But one team could spend, they thought, less than 3 weeks to actually put the most atomic piece in place, which is the transaction. So to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about the network. So there's the back office systems. The customer information system needs to talk to the MDC or the meter data controller, which goes out through the IT network, through the wireless communication network, and actually talks to the meters. So what we were able to do is that we found out that there was a tool that was sort of a diagnostic tool that could communicate directly with the meters. So we found out that somebody in the field with this sort of laptop in their truck could drive up in front of the house and talk to the smart meter directly and shut it off. So the existing business process was somebody would drive up to the house and they'd go up and physically knock on the door, do the notification, and then they, once they'd done that, they go around the back of the house and they'd pull the switch on the meter. That was the manual process. So the first change we made was was a slight modification of that. So now the same person would drive up to the house and they'd knock on the door and do the final notification. And then instead of going around the back of the house, they go back to their truck and they push the button and either connect or disconnect or reconnect the meter. So that took out the need for the automated phone calls. Didn't change the volume any because still the same people driving around the truck, but they could be a little bit more productive because they didn't need to go and kind of like do the heavy work of, you know, climbing up the meter with a ladder or whatever and turning it off. This had a whole range of benefits, and which, you know, I can go into in the questions. But among the benefits were we could do slightly more transactions. What was happening is, as there was attrition and they weren't replacing people, it was getting harder and harder for them to staff disconnects as the project went on. And so this made those people in the field that were remaining in the field more productive because they had slightly less work to do for each connect or disconnect. It also led to the need to not roll a heavy truck to do that work. So you didn't need somebody with all the tools to work on the physical infrastructure anymore. And you know, somebody in a Suburban or a regular car could go around and do this. So it reduced the cost of transportation and kind of the equipment needed to do these things. Then the next thing we did is, okay, so we had that, and as we were able to get that working, then that team did their work, that development team. So it didn't take them one sprint, as you know, often the case. There's a little bit of underestimation. It actually took them a couple of sprints, so maybe a month and a half or 2 months to do the work. Once they got that work in place, then the same process, but instead of communicating directly with the meter, that person in the field was now able to communicate back through that back-end infrastructure, not all the way through all of the systems integrated, but just through that sort of system that was talking directly to the meters in the field. The next thing was that we were able to scale up. So we were able to get more people doing that work in parallel. From our initial pilot, we were able to roll that out to everybody, so that everybody in the field was doing that work. Then we were able to gradually scale it back so that a person in the back office could do the reconnects. So we had people in the field still doing the disconnects just to be sure that everything was okay. But when it came time to reconnect, we were reconnecting from, you know, specially mobilized force in the back office. Then we sort of integrated and moved that back office back to the, you know, the further back up the chain. As we were able to integrate things and automate things more fully, we were able to scale up that back office function, and there was still some manual work involved in the back office, but we were able to do away with the front office, or with the field portion for most of the disconnects and reconnects. And then finally, we were able to integrate it so that the people in the call center were able to do the work. The people who would eventually be responsible for the transactions were able to do the work. So they were able to do away with our specially mobilized task force. And then eventually we were able to fully automate it. So what that led us to do is that we had this initial idea that we were going to go on for an amount of time, and we were going to suddenly do this huge amount of scope and get all this value. What we realized is we were running late and we might not be able to get all that value. So we decided we would take things incrementally and we'd get a little bit of value at a time, and we'd get a little bit more value, and then we'd get a little bit more value, all the while reducing the risk that we'd get no value at all because we'd learn something that would make the project, you know, either prohibitively expensive or so complicated that we wouldn't get it done. So we were able to do things in a risk-first manner, so the riskiest thing first, the newest thing first, and a value-first manner. So we're getting the most value for each component that we could with a minimal amount of work. So, you know, compared to where we would have gotten in the end on this particular sub-project, we got pretty much to the same place. We didn't get all of the value by the time we'd originally estimated we'd get all the value, but because we pulled some of the value up sooner, we sort of came out net about equal. So by doing these stepwise investment checks, we were able to deliver business value, we were able to reduce risk, we were able to address cultural factors where people in the field and in the different back office functions were suspicious of the new technology. We increased knowledge as we went, and which was internalized in the organization. And ultimately, it was a business decision at each increment that the business could very closely control whether they were ready to move forward. What might have been, if we'd learned all this stuff and figured it all out earlier in the project and not spent 2 years sort of redoing the requirements in big chunks, is that we might have started doing this incremental thing from the very beginning. And so all of that original project value might have been enhanced or increased because we would have delivered it much further, and we probably would have leveraged that learning to get even more value than had originally been projected to be possible, because we would have identified opportunities along the way. So all of that amount of money, basically in hindsight, was left on the table because we didn't implement a way of learning that was optimal by the end of what we learned on the project. So if the company was going to do the project again, and they were going to introduce, with perfect hindsight, they were going to introduce Agile methods and improve business prioritization from the very beginning, this is what might have been possible and might have been achieved. So, some of the lessons from that is really that you want to embrace the risk. You really want to fail fast to learn fast, and that Agile principles give you a way to do things. By doing that, by assessing your risk, breaking things down, dynamically prioritizing first by risk and value, seeking to maximize the knowledge gain, and then when you've identified from a business standpoint that you have enough value or that there's something more valuable to do, you have a business decision to stop investing in one thing and invest in something different. So that's this sort of summary of this story that I told. I think the real question to think about if you're getting ready to do a big project like that, and in light of what this project learned, is, are you really steering by scope? Are you saying that we've got all these things we can't possibly live without them? Or do you have a way to steer by the value that you're uncovering as you learn more, and by the risks that you're seeing or that you're scared of? And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Justin, and you can hopefully there'll be some questions and we can take those questions. I'm sorry I went a little bit longer than your 30 minutes.
Oh, that's all right. That's more than okay. We shoot for 30 minutes, but I have no problem with you going over.
Okay.
We do actually have questions waiting already.
Okay.
So I will start by forwarding on the first one to you. This is from Maureen, and she asks, in regards to learning and adopting the Scrum approach, describe more about the training plan. What types of training were provided? Who was trained? When were they trained, etc.? And I'll send you a copy of that via chat also.
Okay. Sure. So that's a good question. Yeah, so this was a case where we had to mobilize a lot of people in a short period of time. And so just to give you an idea, this was about right around this time of the year, about, it must be, what is it, 2014? So that's been 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So we basically, I started on April 1st. It took about a month to draw that red line, blue line graph. It took about another, so that now it's beginning of May. It took about until the end of May to kind of mobilize things and reassign people to this, from other projects to this project, and kind of get a space to work in. So what we did was we grabbed together like a very temporary, we got some temporary space in the building that wasn't being used. It was, we pulled in tables. We made a place to house this department. We had to scramble around and get everybody to pull that together and to kind of be creative. While then we set that up so people went away for Memorial Day weekend, and when they came back on Tuesday, that's when everything was set up to move them into their new space. And so we co-located. While the co-location was taking place, we took advantage of that downtime. We took everybody off-site for basically a 3-day training boot camp. And so we taught them about the project and the business case and what was at stake. We had sent some people to Scrum Master training ahead of time, but we trained everybody on the fundamentals of Scrum that you need to get started. We had the business people there, the CIO was there, the business leader of the project and the vice presidents were there, explaining their support and what was important about achieving the goals, what they were prepared to do in support of those goals. And we did some work then understanding kind of some workshops for understanding. We broke people into their sub-teams at that point, what we thought would be their sub-teams as best we could tell. We had people do work in their teams. We had the business people do work in that boot camp on their initial ability to set priorities, and we kind of came back together. So when everybody came back after that 3-day boot camp on to the 4-day week, right? So on the Friday, they basically had 1 day to assemble everything they needed to do to get started in their first sprint or their sprint 0. So we sort of did that 4-day boot camp, 3-day boot camp, 1 day to assemble your backlog, and then you had 1 sprint to get everything organized to groom your backlog and then get started in this new direction. So that's in essence the way that we implemented the changes. It was a fairly high shock way to do things, but it was in response to what we had identified as an extraordinary challenge, and so it was warranted in the case that we were in.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Next question, we've got a group joining us from the Office of the Courts. They ask, can you describe the process used to identify value? How do you calculate the value part of the equation on the risk versus value?
Yeah, well, in this case, and in a lot of cases, so we had a lot of pre-work to build on. So people had, they brought in consultants, they looked at other utilities, they had all kinds of analysis based on their existing business process and their future business process and what other utilities had done in terms of the basic business case was cost savings with a little bit of added value in terms of things that customers would be willing to pay for, or other factors. So there was sort of this recipe for value based on a lot of analysis that had been done. And so what we really did in terms of determining how valuable a chunk of work would be in a dynamic nature was to say, well, if we had that chunk in place today, how much of the cost savings could we realize? So how much cost reduction would there be if we had that thing today? And so then not having that thing today, the difference between what the cost savings would be and what you're paying now, that is the value of that chunk of work. And so as we broke things down, we were able to say, like, okay, if we had this functionality in place and we were able to do, for example, reconnects from the field, we still had to do disconnects in the field, but we could do reconnects from the central office, then we would be able to have half as many trips into the field to do connect. So or we'd be able to do twice as many, depending on how you look at it. But either way, that's how we would calculate the value of that increment of functionality that let us go from having to go into the field to do both disconnects and reconnects to being able to do half of those transactions from the central office. So that's just an example, but that's basically based on the cost of delay, given an understanding of the benefits that were available.
Gotcha. So it sounds like it's somewhat similar to effort estimating to it, that there's no absolute scale that it's running on, but it's internally consistent.
That's right. I mean, everybody, nobody knows until you actually, a lot of times you can't see the value until you've actually implemented it. So we had a pretty good estimate of what we thought it would be, and then we were also able to learn, like after we'd done that thing, and so now we were actually not doing those connections in the field, or those reconnections in the field, we were able to see like what actually resulted, what costs were actually avoided. Was it all of the costs we had thought, or not quite as many of the costs we had thought, or more? And so we were able to bring that information in as well. So we were able to do, in foresight, and then also to correct our learning in hindsight.
Great. How long was this process a pure business and planning process before the IT side implementation actually started?
So, I mean, these types of projects in the utility space are, particularly because of the sort of dance between regulators and the utility, they go on for, there was like, just kind of by necessity in that process, there was a couple of years of work back and forth with the regulators. When the project was actually green-lighted, I think they began the IT analysis pretty quickly. So there was kind of a couple of years of business side analysis and business case decision making. When the capital was actually allocated, there were business analysts from IT involved in the work for, basically, people were trying to get working on it, but it was there was several years of work before they actually began working on the business processes that I'm talking about here.
Gotcha. And then so from a Scrum perspective, you just kind of accept that this is what's happened and then try to approach it in the most Scrum-like fashion from that point forward.
Correct. But that's kind of what I was sort of trying to get at the end there, is that, if we're going to do it again, the optimal thing would be to break things down to a certain degree and then just get started on them, given the information about value that you had at the time and given the engine for learning that we were able to put in place. We would have learned all the things that we eventually learned much, much earlier. We would have been able to focus our attention, and so we probably would have been able to get the value that we actually had gotten in the business case. We probably would have been able to achieve a value beyond the business case, which would have flowed directly to the bottom line for, in this case, the way things work, it would have flowed directly to the bottom line for investors.
All right, wonderful. So one of the benefits of Agile is its ability to respond to change. Were there any big course changes or pivots in your process during this? What was the most impactful change? And when everything was said and done, how close were you guys to the original plan?
Well, so there were many ups and downs and surprises along the way. Some of them were on the project that I described. Some of them were on other projects. So if you go back, I'm going to take things back a bit here to this graph, just a little bit. Probably, I don't know what this looks like on WebEx, but I don't know. This will get back here. So this is kind of
fine.
Yeah. So this is kind of indicative of the rate of change. So if you look at the way those colored bars are sorted on the right, that's the way they actually came out in terms of value obtained by business process. And if you look at the value on the left, the way they're sorted on the left, that's what people thought the value was going to be going in. So as we learned and reprioritized different chunks of those projects in response to that, that kind of gives you an indication of the order of what was learned and what was changed. So there were some areas of the business where we didn't actually get any savings that we thought we were going to get. There are other areas of the business where we got more savings than we thought we were going to get. In particular, one big change is that sort of salmon-colored bar, which is the fourth from the right, the lost revenue protection. So an interesting thing about that one is that, so they thought, at the outset of the project, they thought that was the third most valuable component of what could be done, right? So they thought that actually right after disconnects and reconnects, that would be the most valuable thing. And what lost revenue protection in the utility is kind of the same as it is in retail. Basically, people are stealing power. They're either stealing power, it could be inadvertent, like there's something hooked up where things are not getting metered, or there's some kind of trickle loss, things are being lost. There's some kind of fault in the system, or a lot of the most sensational aspect of it is kind of like marijuana growers who are stealing power to avoid being caught doing something illegal. So they're they'd tap around the transformer somehow, or around the meter, and connect power directly to a house, so they can run like a gazillion watts of grow light in a house somewhere. And so in that type of situation, there's a whole department that's kind of like the Ghostbusters of fraudbusters of the utility. So they get all these leads and they run around and try to track them down and find the bad guys. But what we learned through the course of this project is that they were already doing a lot better job than we thought. And then they thought. So as we learned and started getting more information from smart meters, we learned that there was less upside than we thought, because they were already doing such a good job that just a relatively small amount of investment was basically able to get them, to be a lot more efficient, but that there wasn't a lot more revenue to be had there the way that the project originally supposed that there would be. So that was a learning that was, that we're able to get from the better data that the meters provided. But then, so instead of investing a lot more in the technology needed to try to get more, we learned that there wasn't that much more to get, and so we reallocate those resources into some other subcomponent of the project.
All right. We have another question from Maureen. What tips would you offer for addressing when the project's success means people's roles changing and or jobs going away? Did this project include any workforce development planning?
Yeah, so I talked about that earlier, but it did include workforce development planning. This is purely a business side thing, but this is something that this utility did very well compared to their other peers, and just compared to sort of corporate responsibility, they began the workforce change planning well in advance of the project. But everybody accepted that the technology change was causing people's a whole set of jobs to go away, basically. And so they began retraining those people in those roles into new roles in the company, and they basically did that over a period of like 5 years. So with every attrition, they backfilled with a temp, so that there wasn't jobs that were being eliminated that people didn't know that going in. Those people were either took early retirement, they were given opportunities to retrain within the company, they were given access to resources to retrain outside the company, they were given job placement resources. So at the end, there's definitely, from any technology change, there's going to be some winners and some losers, but there was a huge amount of educational opportunity, a huge amount of doors open, and an ongoing effort to do right by the people who were affected by this. On the, to a lesser degree, there's also change in the IT department as we implemented Scrum, and there was less advanced knowledge of that, right? Because we basically did that in response to a crisis. But because of the nature of such a strong and clear sense of purpose, I think what happened was that people were able to see clearly, as in many cases they had never been able to do before, like what they needed to do, what they needed to change for themselves in order to help the company. And so we didn't really have a lot of, there were many challenges and personal challenges along the way that were relatively small, but by the end, the net of most of those was that people had learned a lot and had opportunity to grow a lot and change a lot, and we didn't have a lot of change resistance. We had a lot of people going through change, and we had to deal with that, but we didn't have a lot of sort of set resistance against the change, because everybody could see how important it was and what was at stake and what the benefit that we were realizing almost from the beginning. Because we did it all at once, it was very apparent.
Was there somebody in charge of communicating that message to people?
In this case, the communication was led by, so one of the things that we did was basically pick or identify a new leader for this new IT department that was being formed, with kind of a department within the department. and that leader was the one who took the role of really leading the change and communicating the change. And so having that leadership from very, someone who's respected in the business, already had a lot of organizational connections and credibility on the business side, and was able to bridge that over to the technology side and really, tirelessly advocate for what needed to be done. That was really the seat of change leadership in this project, was the leader of the project, the department.
Yeah, sounds like you got lucky and had a very, very effective champion there.
Yeah, all of the things that made it successful, a lot of things had to come together, but having a champion for the change and the work, that was a very key success factor in hindsight.
Okay, well, we are out of time, so I just wanted to thank everyone for the great questions and for participating. Thank you, Adam, for your presentation.
Yeah.
What?
If you want to, I was going to say, if people have more questions, I will send my slides to Justin, and he can get them out as he always does. And I think you've probably been recording this again.
Yep.
My contact information is available in the slides, and if people have more questions or want to talk more, be very happy to, email or get on a call and talk through some of the more interesting aspects of what we did.
Awesome. All right. Well, it probably comes as no surprise to everybody that we will not be having an Agile Friday next week, since it's the 4th of July. So I hope everybody gets a chance to go out and enjoy that. The week afterwards, on July 11th, we're going to have Jean Richardson from Azure Gate, somebody I understand is an associate of yours as well, Adam.
Yeah,
she'll be joining.
A colleague of mine, yeah.
Yep. She'll be joining us to talk about double loop learning, a force for organizational excellence. You can find out more about what's coming up, and you can also view our previously recorded webinars, like Adam hinted at ocio.wa.gov/agile-fridays. You can also connect with other Agile practitioners in our new Agile community at yammer.com/agile-community, or if you want to see all of our communities, you can go to ocio.wa.gov/communities. Once again, a big thanks to Adam, SOTEC Advisors, and Results Washington for helping to make Agile Fridays a success. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next time. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Justin.
Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.